Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. H. Clark Barrett. He's professor in the Department of Anthropology and director of the Center for Behavior, Evolution and Culture at UCLA. He is a biological anthropologist specializing in evolutionary psychology, the study of the mind's evolved mechanisms and processes. In his work, he uses methods from anthropology and psychology to examine universals and variation in how thinking develops across cultures. His research has focused on learning and conceptual development in several domains, including theory of mind, or the ability to make inferences about others' thoughts and intentions, and learning about danger. He has also collaborated with a variety of anthropologists, psychologists, and other social scientists on a variety of topics, ranging from infant-directed speech to the evolution of morality, and supervised graduate projects on the evolution of cognition. He's the author of the book, The Shape of Thought, How Mental Adaptations Evolve, and mental adaptations are the main topic of our conversation today. So, Dr. Barrett, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Ricardo. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, so, first of all, let's start with this. Is it possible for you to give us I'm not sure if this is a fair question or not, but is there any definition of a mental adaptation that everybody, let's say evolutionary anthropologists and psychologists, would agree on?
Well, that's a two-part question. So I could give you a definition, but I could not guarantee that everyone would agree on it. As you know, there's disagreement about whether there is even such a thing as a mental adaptation. But I would start with the way that I would approach it, and the way that I approach it in the book, which is, I think that it's essentially thinking about mental adaptations is just the union of the concept of an adaptation from biology and then something like the idea of a mental mechanism or a mental process or a mental trait, if you want, from psychology. So I think it's the overarching categories adaptations, which are traits or aspects of the phenotype of an organism that evolved because they contributed to survival and reproduction. So they're just the quintessential products of natural selection as envisioned by Darwin. That captures the set of all adaptations in living things. And then there's the interesting question, which is one of the interesting questions is, what is the subset? How can we think of the subset of those things that are mental? And of course, then we enter into questions in philosophy of mind as what counts as the mind. I take a very pragmatic view to this. I think it's very easy to get into semantic territory about what is mental and what is not. I construe mental traits very, very broadly. They're things that involve taking in information into an organism and then using that information in order to guide behavior. Ultimately, I think that's what the category is. So I wouldn't even define them necessarily in terms of nervous systems. In the book, I talk about bacteria that have behavior guidance systems that I think are clearly adaptations, things that have to do with going towards or away from chemicals or light in chemotaxis and phototaxis. You don't need a nervous system. In humans, we have nervous systems, although I actually suspect there's more than just the nervous system involved with behavior regulation. But those mental adaptations would include any adaptations whose function involves regulating the organism's behavior, ultimately. You do end up with a few definitional issues there because there's lots of stuff that we do in cognition that doesn't directly impact behavior. In fact, you could argue that most of it doesn't impact behavior. Like I can daydream and have all kinds of thoughts. I think those are the product of mental adaptations as well. They ultimately probably do exist because they influence our behavior, and ultimately they've influenced our survival and reproduction. But
But some of those products of mental adaptations that you're talking about, some of them are byproducts of adaptations and not adaptations themselves, right?
That's right. Yes, yes. I generally feel like it's useful to think about the adaptations in terms of the mechanisms, mental mechanisms, and then the things that those mechanisms produce, which are our thoughts and feelings and so on. Those are products of the adaptations, and so many of those could be considered byproducts. Again, there's definitional choices you could make.
Okay, so I guess this is another tricky question, but when we talk about adaptations as mental mechanisms in that case, what do you mean by a mental mechanism? Are you referring only to the bit related to the algorithm, let's say, how the mental mechanism processes information of a certain type and then delivers a certain type of outcome, for example, as behavior, right? Or are you also including certain aspects of our subjective experience?
Wow, that's a great question. I think that ultimately a proper phenotypic approach, I think of these things as all part of the phenotype, and you know, a proper approach there would not try to delineate some aspect of the phenotype as the adaptation, and some aspect of the phenotype is not the adaptation. So in the case that you're talking about, you know, is it the case that the thoughts that are, or the representations that are produced by some kind of mechanism are not part of the adaptation? Well, they're certainly, they're the phenotypic outputs, like the thoughts that we have and the decisions that we make, even though those are just tokens, as I say in the book, you know, they're just momentary products of these things, of the mechanisms. Those are what determine fitness. And so I think to take a proper biological approach, you would have to say, well, those are in a way part of the phenotype that has been selected for. So it's certainly easier to think about mechanisms themselves as being adaptations, but I think that in biology, everything is moving more towards a more holistic idea that you can't delineate out some parts of the phenotype. The products, the behavioral products themselves are part of the phenotype. And you know, something an approach that resonates with is, well, Dawkins' idea of the extended phenotype from the early 80s, but now this idea of niche construction, that's very popular in biology, that says, well, if I build a house, it's true that house is part of the environment. I've made it part of the environment, but it's also the product of my behavior and my decisions. And there's some way in which, you know, my house is actually influencing my fitness, my ability to survive. And so there's a sense in which it is part of the adaptations. You know, it's part of my mental adaptations, my ability to create artifacts that then influence my own survival. I think ultimately we do need to include those as part of the adaptations, even though that's very, in some ways, it's a challenging way to think about it. I think it's probably the correct way to think about it.
So when you talk about mental adaptations in your work, and more specifically in your book, are you referring only to biological / evolutionary adaptations, or are you also referring to cultural adaptations? I mean, do you know what I'm trying to ask here? Because there's also, nowadays there are also lots of people that do work on cultural evolutionary theory, right? And some of them, like Joe Henrich and others, talk about adaptations that have derived from cultural evolution or cultural processes operating on our minds, right?
Yeah. Right. I think, first of all, I do think that there is a useful distinction between adaptations that arise through a process of genetic adaptation, in a nutshell, versus ones that evolve through cultural adaptation. I think that's a useful, that can be a useful distinction. On the other hand, you can tell that I have a holistic approach to these things. Ultimately, I think that that cultural adaptations, and let's call them biological adaptations, are part of a continuum of how organisms adapt. I don't think that, I think that you can make some distinctions about the kinds of processes that are involved with those in the evolution of those adaptations, but you can't really draw a hard line causally between them, because the feedback loops that are involved with cultural adaptation are not disentangleable from the feedback loops that are involved in biological adaptation. And I mentioned niche construction a little while ago. I mean, there are great examples from non-human animals where the evolution of the adaptation, like birds' nests or something like that, probably involved some complicated forms of learning and transmission of learned behaviors along with genetic evolution. So the bottom line is I absolutely think that cultural evolution occurs, that there are cultural adaptations, and I would include them within the broader set of biological adaptations. I wouldn't really put them as a separate category, but I think you can make distinctions between the processes, yeah.
So you mentioned learning, and I was laughing a little bit because that reminded me of another big topic that we can explore today, that is the one of modularity and the different kinds of modules that people talk about, right? So, I mean, this notion of massive modularity of the mind or of the human mind has been on the table for some decades now, and it's a very controversial one. First of all, because it's hard to define what the module really is, right? Or if it corresponds to some specific area in the brain, or some sort of connection between different areas or something like that. And then also because people make this distinction between domain specific and domain general modules, right? So could you tell us perhaps first, what do you think a module is, or at least what most people are talking about when they talk about a mental module?
Yeah, I think that there's no single answer to this. I think that just as when we in biology, if we talk about a trait, if you were to try to unpack the question of what is a trait in biology, you would end up in the same sort of semantic and pragmatic problem space, because it's difficult to say what is a trait. Is my thumb a trait? Given that the genes that control the development of my thumb include many genes that also control the development of my other fingers and my toes, should we consider those to be the trait? I do go back to biology and the way biologists think about modularity. There is a very good literature in evolutionary biology over the past decades that embraces the concept of modularity. And one aspect of modularity they talk about is something like developmental modularity, just in the way that I was just talking about. There's a way in which you consider your thumb and your big toe to be part of the same developmental module, because they are the same developmental processes, not exactly the same, but there's overlap in the processes that shape those. The key thing about modularity, though, is something like decomposability or separability. And that's how people in evolutionary biology think about it. When they say that an organism is developmentally or evolutionarily modular, what that means to them, to evolutionary biologists in this literature, is that natural selection can influence one part of the organism and shape it semi-independently of other parts of the organism. And that's the way that they define modularity in evolutionary biology. And I think that's quite useful. It's almost the same as the way that biologists think about a trait. If when natural selection makes your left leg longer, it also makes your right leg longer, then in some sense, leg length is the trait, not right or left legs. And the approach that I take in my book and my other writings on modularity, I think we should think of the mind in a similar way. It's the fundamental feature of modularity is sort of separability or decomposability. Are two mental processes entirely overlapping, or are they distinct in some way functionally, is one question. And can they be separated in terms of evolutionarily? Can they evolve separately, is one question. And then another question is, in terms of information processing or function, how they control the organism or influence behavior, are they separate? And one thing that's absolutely clear is, and even people that I disagree with in their approach to modularity agree on this point, people like Jerry Fodor, it is not a black and white category. So modularity concerns the degree to which things are separable, but there's a whole range from completely overlapping, which makes them essentially part of the same module, to completely distinct. The completely distinct end of the continuum is kind of rare in cognition because everything interacts. The last thing I'll say, and I'm happy to talk about this more, is that I really like the idea, people like Bullmore and Sporns, who are neuroscientists who talk about the modularity of the brain. They are fond of this idea of hierarchical modularity, which I think is also quite important. So in living systems, you sort of can have modules nested within modules, or nested within, they may not even be the right way to put it because everything is somewhat cross-cutting. A better way to think of it is you can have modularity at one level of a system, of a complex system, that does not exclude other kinds of modularity at other levels. Mm-hmm. And this has been known about the brain for decades. If you look at the way that something like the visual system processes information, there are, at some higher level of analysis of the network of cells in the visual system, there's functional division of labor in very higher level abstract ways. But if you go down into a micro level, you also see that there's modularity at a more fine-grained level of analysis. So things like cells that have a very, very fine grain, that respond to the orientation of lines, for example. And there's modularity at the level of, degrees of angle of a line as seen on the retina. Each of those is handled by a different set of cells in the visual system. Higher up, those cells also collaborate to produce representations that have a modular component as well. So hierarchical modularity is really important, and that's actually what's missing from views of people like Jerry Fodor, who don't. It's not necessarily he's not with us anymore. It's not necessarily that Fodor would disagree with hierarchical modularity, but if you go back and read his 1983 book, The Modularity of Mind, it's not part of that discussion. And it seems like now one of the things that's coming out empirically of neuroscience of the brain is that there's hierarchical modular organization at many levels, and that I think that there's just there's clear empirical evidence that that's the case.
Mm-hmm. So since we've already talked a little bit about mental adaptations, is it the case that all modules are adaptations or not?
That's a great question. I would say that in the way that I think about it, and again, I think there are multiple possible fruitful ways of thinking about this. It can be it's true that any individual module is the product of adaptations. You don't get modular organization without some kind of developmental system whose adaptive target is to produce modules. I don't think there's any harm necessarily in in saying that each of the modules that's produced by a developmental system is in some sense an adaptation. The problem is that you want to be very clear that that does not mean that each of those is, as a token of a developmental process, something that has in some way been directly selected for, separate from the other modules that are produced by the developmental system. So let me give you some examples. If you think about the cellular organization of the body of a person or any other animal, we have these specialized cells, right? So we have various kinds of skin cells. If I took any individual skin cell of mine and said, is that an adaptation? It's certainly modular, right? I mean, there's many ways in which an individual cell is a module. But, you know, there's billions of skin cells. It would be a mistake to think that any particular skin cell that I identify is actually a unique adaptation. The skin cells themselves as a sort of unit, the skin is an adaptation, right? I would say that makes sense. And under the terms that I talked about before, I actually think something like the skin or the layer, you know, the layers of skin on our bodies, those are modules. Our skin is actually a module, a biological module. But in the hierarchical sense, it's also composed of many, many, many smaller modules. Yes, each of those is you know, the sum total of the skin cells are an adaptation. And each of those tokens you could consider to be an adaptation in some way, but you just want to be very clear that this has caused enormous confusion in the literature, I think, in psychology. You know, what you don't want to say is that each of those has been uniquely selected for as a token. There's a sort of type that's produced by an adaptation. And each token of the type can be considered a module, but they're not independently selected modules.
And what about this distinction that many people, or I guess even most people from philosophy of mind and evolutionary psychology and evolutionary anthropology and disciplines like that make between domain-specific and domain-general modules? Do you think that's a useful one? That's a useful way of thinking about how different mental mechanisms work in the brain? Do you think it has any flaws with it, or what's your opinion on that?
Yes, again, this will be, you'll see a recurring theme in my answers here. There's a yes and a no to the question. So I wrote a paper some years back called "Every Adaptation Has a Domain," and the logic of that argument, which is not original with me, is that, you know, for any adaptation that you think about, it's been selected for because of its functions in some way. So when we think about a wing as an adaptation on a bird, or you know, if we think about the lungs or the liver organs, you know, the eye, or even at smaller scales, like a cell, or even something like an enzyme within a cell. Each of those things can be considered an adaptation, and each of them has a domain in the sense that each of them has some kind of a function that's been selected to perform, and that mechanistic function and the way that that's realized in physical material is going to, you know, establish a domain. So if you think about what hemoglobin does, there's in some sense in which hemoglobin has a domain. There's a set of things in the world that it operates on, and it operates on them in a certain way. When you think about the wing of a bird, it has a domain in that, you know, it's designed in a certain way to act upon air, and using the muscles of the bird. Those create a set of, you know, what we would in psychology would call sort of input conditions, or a set of things in the world that it operates on. Okay, so if we translate that into the mind, I made the argument in that paper that every mental adaptation in some way has to have a domain in that sense as well, because they all perform some kind of function. So if you look at it from that point of view, I would say that the distinction between domain specific and domain general is not really useful. On the other hand, I don't want to deny that when people in psychology talk about something like a continuum between more domain general and more domain specific adaptations, that they're not, I mean, I don't think it's meaningless. I think that often when people are talking about domain-specific and domain-general adaptations, they are many of the debates are talking past each other in a certain way. I'm perfectly happy to entertain that there's more general purpose kinds of adaptations and more special purpose adaptations. But one of the things that I've argued is that makes the most sense in cases where the function of one modular adaptation can be nested within the function of another, or somehow as a subset. So going back to the visual system as an example, you can certainly see that, you know, some of the processes in the visual system that are dedicated to particular shapes or lines or angles, you know, have to be more domain specific than the adaptations that aggregate the results of those processes and create some sort of a more complete representation of a shape. There, it seems to me perfectly well defined that one level is more specific and the other is more general. But if you want to say something like, is a wing more domain specific than an eye? I think that's very, you know, it's very difficult to say. You're better off just saying, this is what the wing evolved to do, this is what the eye evolved to do. And when it comes to the brain, I think, similarly, when we, you know, if you actually look at brain functions, it's extremely difficult to find any that don't carry out some function of some kind, and that means that they have a domain. So it would be very difficult to array the brain's mechanisms along the line from more domain general to domain specific, I think. But I don't want to deny that the concept of this continuum between general and specific is not meaningless. It's just when you actually make it practical, it becomes very difficult to do. And the last thing that I'll say, and maybe we'll talk about this more later, is that what I do think has caused conceptual confusion in psychology and neuroscience is specifically the idea that that the continuum between domain general and domain specific in some way maps onto the continuum between things that are the product of evolution and the things that aren't, or even a continuum between sort of modular and non-modular parts of the brain. This is one of the concerns I've had with Jerry Fodor, where he wanted to sort of make it definitional that modules are domain specific. He didn't go very far in saying that those are the products of evolution and the central systems aren't, but he drew a hard line between a sort of layer of domain-specific modules and then this totally domain-general central system, which, again, is not a meaningless distinction, but I think as a black and white distinction, that's done a lot of harm. And it continues today in dual systems theories, which, again, I do think have some meaning. But they do, by creating hard binary distinctions across things that are not binary, which few things in biology are, I think that they've caused conceptual confusion in the field.
Yeah. So, and let me ask you this. Do you think that it makes sense to think that any sort of mental mechanism that we have is general purpose and completely open-ended? I'm asking you this because on the one hand it seems that we are sort of prepared or come prepared to learn certain specific things about the world, about other people that we interact with, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, and I'm not sure if this is sort of a distraction or something like that, we also have the arts and the sciences and philosophy, and so it seems that we are able to expand our domains of, let's say, of learning, for example, and I mean, even think and talk about things that are so abstract that some of them don't even seem to have anything to do with anything, let's say. Right.
Yes, I know what you mean. I share that intuition, and I see where that intuition comes from. I think that it makes a lot of sense that people use examples like the arts, the products of science, many other kinds of things. Those are commonly used as examples to demonstrate that there must be parts of the mind and mental mechanisms that are not domain specific. Again, under a certain level of description, I think that's okay, but I think that the problem with that is that leaving it at that in some ways skips over the interesting question of how those products of the human mind and human activity are actually created. And I think that if you looked at how those were created, there's not enough research on this. I think there should be more. You would find that many aspects of those things, like philosophy, art, music, are actually created by domain-specific mechanisms. The learning mechanisms that are involved, the conceptual mechanisms that are involved. And then the question would become, which we're far from being able to answer, if you were to sort of create a truly kind of process-based mechanistic description of how philosophy, how academic philosophy, okay, how it evolved, how it developed historically, how it's created by the collaboration of people's minds and activities. If you created a fully processual mechanistic account of how that happened historically, then the question is, would there be any domain general mechanisms that would be needed to explain that? That's kind of a thought experiment. I do think that there are processes like when you look at various kinds of feedback processes that occur in cultural evolution, in social learning, and individual learning, they are, as you say, extremely open-ended. I think that the behaviorists had it right in some way when they talked about mechanisms of reinforcement. I know there's a technical literature on this that, there's a lot of details there. It's not to say that the exact account that someone like Skinner had was correct, but they did identify these processes that, when you do something and it's rewarded, it increases your probability of doing it again. If it's punished, it decreases that probability. I think that those processes do exist. They probably are adaptations. And they seem quite open-ended. The thing about those kinds of processes is that I think that they only work because they operate on other processes that are themselves more specific. So if you think about reinforcement of motor behavior, like actions, there's a whole very, very specialized process involved with, okay, I'm thirsty, I want some water. I have to recognize what water is. I go to the sink. I select the proper receptacle. I open the tap. I put the water in. I drink it. It tastes good. There's a reinforcement process that makes me want to do that again when I'm thirsty. I would agree that that process is probably domain general, but it only works because of all of these other very specialized processes that it's shaping. And that's, I think, a characteristic of hierarchical systems that I was talking about. I don't think that you could have, well, I may be wrong about this, but it seems like the power of what we can call domain general systems, which are maybe systems that you can see resting on top of a bunch of other specialized systems, their domain general power comes from the integration of lots of more domain specific things. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. A metaphor that can sometimes be made people talk about this in computer science. When you have computer systems tend to be hierarchically organized as well. There are higher level kinds of processes that can look at the outputs of lower level systems like categorization systems and so on, and then those can make kind of open-ended decisions about what things to reinforce or what things to select, but they would be powerless if it wasn't for the more domain-specific mechanisms that, whether you want to say they're underneath them or not is a spatial metaphor, I don't know, but they rely on them. And I would say that when we look at our, this is one of the things that I mean by additivism, this concept in the book, that when we look at our incredible flexibility and our incredible creativity as individuals and a species, it rests upon the fact that we have so much specialized stuff that interacts to produce art, to produce philosophy, to produce mathematics. It wouldn't happen just from general purpose processes, is a way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. And so, do you think that there's any set of criteria that we can use to say that something, that a particular mental mechanism, for example, is an adaptation? Because as far as I understand it, it doesn't necessarily have to be something innate. It can be developmental. It can come online later on in development or in a particular organism's life, right? So, I mean, there are all of those things and different traits that adaptations can have. Is there any specific set of criteria that we can use, and if that kind of mental mechanism checks all of those criteria, then we can say it's an adaptation or not?
Yeah. Well, I think there's an empirical and a theoretical question. And I think that in some ways the theoretical question is easier to answer than the empirical question. Theoretically, I think that it's fairly, when we think of sort of replicating systems in a Darwinian sense, the idea that some feature or component of that system stabilizes itself over time, or causes it to persist, or causes it to persist relative to other versions of it. I think that's fairly easy to conceptualize. So, you know, if we had a sort of omniscient view of the way that aspects of organisms had come into being, we would be able to delineate those ones that were there because of natural selection or not. And that's really what it means to be an adaptation. Is it the product of natural selection or not? So that's, in some sense, although it's very abstract, it has an answer, I think. The empirical question of how we as scientists or observers would be able to tell whether something is an adaptation is extremely much more difficult. I think that the direct answer to your question is there a sort of checklist. Probably not one that would work across all different kinds of adaptations, ranging from sort of physiological adaptations to psychological adaptations. You need different kinds of checklists. I will also say that the checklists that people have attempted to use, many of those are just not right at all. There's a debate in its journal JPSP some years ago between me and some of my colleagues and some psychologists who argued that, basically going from Jerry Fodor's views, that something like automaticity is a checklist for something being an adaptation. That, you know, if upon being presented with some kind of stimulus, you automatically have some reaction to it, that's a sign that there's an adaptation there. I think that's a mistake. I mean, as I argue in that paper and elsewhere, I think things that are deliberate, aspects of our cognition that are deliberate, are also the product of adaptations. I had something else to say, but now I've forgotten it. So,
okay. So let me just pick on one of the last things that you said there. You mentioned automaticity, and I wanted to ask you, what is your opinion on dual systems theory? That is the distinction that some people make between two different systems operating on the human mind, specifically System 1 and System 2, which System 1 would be fast and reflective, let's say, and I mean, would be, sometimes people imply that it's effortless, even though that's a little bit controversial, right? And System 2, that would be basically the one associated with reflection, with reason, would be slower and more effortful. Do you think that that approach makes sense from your perspective or not?
Yeah, great question. I think it's a real distinction. I think, but here's what I would say that the distinction rides on. If I understand this literature correctly, the central difference between System 1 and System 2 processes is whether consciousness or volition is involved. So when we say that something is deliberate, it means essentially that you are, it involves you, whatever that means, your conscious mind attending to a particular task. You're aware of what the task is, the processes that are involved. In some aspects of them are conscious. So when we talk about reasoning, most people by reasoning mean that you're consciously thinking about something. I want to be clear. I think that is a very real distinction. I think consciousness exists. I think there are some conscious processes and some non-conscious processes. I think that I actually think that something like volition or will or mental effort exists. So to the extent that that distinguishes between System 2 and System 1, I think that's right. I think that I think that we know that there's many mental processes that are subconscious. Again, it may not be totally binary. It's not like there's necessarily a wall between conscious and unconscious processes, but it's true that there's lots of processing going on in your mind that you're not aware of. Some of that processing, that unconscious processing, I would say that there's pretty good, reasons to think that some of it is very slow. So things like there's unconscious rumination. We all have this experience where we're trying to figure out some problem, and we're doing it consciously in System 2, right? How do I figure out blah, whatever the problem is? Then you leave it behind, and you don't think about it anymore. And then maybe 2 weeks later or a month later, some solution to the problem enters your awareness. Right? Like, eureka. That implies that there's been something going on outside of consciousness, some sort of processing, some sort of digestion of the problem that you're not aware of, that then has to be done in, is it System 1? I guess System 1, the subconscious part of the mind. That's very slow because it takes several weeks and then gives you the answer. So I do think that it's not the case that there's a certain set of features that's associated with one and not the other than, is it conscious or not? I think that's the main distinction. And then I'm happy to talk about this more because I'm fascinated by it. But the last thing that I'll say is I think there's, one of the major challenges and interesting questions facing psychology and neuroscience is, of course, what is consciousness? That's one thing that people are trying to find out. But also, is there some sense in which we can talk about what consciousness is for? I grapple with this in the book a little bit. Why is it the case that some processes are handled consciously and some processes not? I do think that's a very real distinction. But I think that we want to be careful in thinking about that from a proper biological and functional point of view. What I think is a mistake is to say something like, the System 1 subconscious processes are the evolved processes, and that consciousness is somehow not an evolved process. That seems very unlikely to be true to me. I think, on the other hand, that the fact that we're conscious, and I think that many other organisms are too, it's entirely possible, as some neuroscientists, philosophers say, that maybe consciousness is an accidental. Consciousness itself could, in some sense, be some sort of an accidental thing, but that could explain the origins of it in some sense. But then once it's there, I have the strong hunch that natural selection shapes what we use consciousness for, and that humans in particular use our conscious awareness in a way that's been extremely useful for us in survival and reproduction. So I think in that sense, consciousness almost certainly has some sort of function and has functional role to play in cognition. So that's a long way of saying system 1, system 2, I think, is a real thing. I think it's more complicated than people say. I think it rides on the distinction between conscious and unconscious processes, and I think that's one of the most fascinating questions for people to answer. I don't know if we'll answer it in my lifetime or yours, but if I were a young student going into neuroscience or psychology, I would definitely consider that as one of the problems I would work on.
Okay, so let's have consciousness as the last topic of our conversation today, because I'm also very fascinated by it, and I've already had several different philosophers of mind and other people on the show to talk about consciousness. So at a certain point there you mentioned that it seems that at least some mental mechanisms operate completely at a subconscious level. They are outside of our awareness completely, it seems, and there are others that are more conscious, and some of them even seem, at least to us, to be directed by our consciousness or conscious mechanisms, let's say. But I was just wondering if that is really the case, in the sense that there are people that imply, at least, that probably what we experience at the conscious level is not really it's not really, let's say, part of the mechanism itself. It's just some sort of information that we get from other things that operate at the subconscious level. And so, for example, I think that one good example would be self-deception, because we have the mechanism of deception, let's say, operating at the subconscious level, processing information from the environment, other people, and our position in our social group, let's say, and so on and so forth. And then what we get consciously is just, I don't know, probably some piece of information to tell us that we are better than we really are, or that we are better than other people, and things like that. And it doesn't, and sometimes at least, it doesn't really seem to have that an important influence over what operates at the level of the mechanism and information processing and things like that. Does this make sense in any way, or?
Yes, no, those are great questions. I think I would make one distinction. I think there's many distinctions to make. So one is the question of whether choices are made consciously, I guess would be a way of putting it. This is something you're alluding to, that many philosophers and neuroscientists, pointing to various kinds of evidence, suggest that, let's call them decisions, are not actually made. They're made outside of consciousness, and that you become aware of the decision in some sense.
Yeah.
I'm sympathetic to that view. I've seen some of the classic neuroscience stuff that suggests, the neural signal that the decision is being made occurs before you're aware, and I think that actually even those experiments might be the conclusions being drawn might not be right. But I certainly, that's certainly possible. On that sense, the feeling of will, the feeling of volition is an epiphenomenon in some way. My hunch is that that's probably not true, but I'm also an empirical person, and if neuroscientists find persuasive evidence, I certainly think that it's possible. I think that it would be very strange if that were the case, but there's strange things in the world, and so I'm not ruling that out. But so that question of whether you are the decider, okay, let's put it that way. Your consciousness actually plays some role in decision and in processing of information. I think that's one question, and I agree that that answer is still not in yet. There's another question, which is, if you've become aware of some information, is there a difference? Does that make a functional difference in what happens with that information, as opposed to cases where you're not aware of that information? And there, I think that's a different question, right? I mean, it may be related, but I actually think that there's good reasons to think that there is a big difference between what happens when you become aware of some information and when you're not aware of information. So in that sense, I do think that consciousness in that sense is very unlikely to be epiphenomenal. There is, when you let's use the colloquial term realization. When something occurs to you, when you have a realization of something, like, oh, yes, this is where I left my keys, or this is how I'm going to solve this problem. I think it's very unlikely that doesn't have some effect on the course of information processing in your brain, and how that information ends up being used, compared to if that had not entered consciousness. So that, to me, provides a sort of clue that consciousness plays a functional role. That it's not just merely a light is turned on illuminating some process that was happening anyway. Instead, when the light is turned on, it actually and illuminates some phenomenon in your consciousness. That creates one possibility is that creates a form of representation of that information, either the way it's represented or where it gets fed into the mind. That's different than if that conscious illumination had not occurred on that particular thing. I suspect that there's many examples. I think of, so this is very much related to the phenomenon of attention that psychologists talk about. We all know that it's possible to, there's a lot of research in vision, that I can look around, and there's much of this scene that I'm seeing right now, which you can't see because it's behind the computer screen, that I can see, and lots of it is being processed in some way, but there's a question of how much I'm consciously aware of. If I focus my attention on a particular object and start entertaining certain things about that object, that is going to cause that information to be processed differently than if it's just sort of unconsciously being passed through my my mental processing system. So in that sense, I do think it's a very interesting question. What difference does it make for some information to enter consciousness as opposed to not? I think it does probably make a difference, and that there might lie a clue to what the function of consciousness is. Just in case we want to discuss this more, I won't belabor this too much, but one of the things I talk about, which I'm very interested in my book, is that one sort of design feature of consciousness that I think is very interesting, that many neuroscientists and philosophers have talked about, is that it's a kind of serial channel. It's of course not entirely serial, but when we make this distinction between serial and parallel processing, one of the virtues of the brain is that it's a massively, massively parallel system. There's no reason why you can't process millions of pieces of information simultaneously. There is no CPU in the brain, right? It's distributed processing, and so you would think that for most things, that's a benefit to be able to process lots of stuff simultaneously. And then we have this other relatively narrow channel of conscious awareness, where we can only think about a small amount of stuff at one time, either in terms of the words that we're entertaining or the visual imagery that we're entertaining. It's not massively parallel, and I think that offers a clue about what it's for. And I like the idea that it's because we talk about this executive idea, but that there needs to be a serial channel in order to make decisions about how to control the body. You need to have some system that says, this is where I'm putting my eyes. This is what I'm going to listen to. This is the place I'm going to go with my body. This is where I'm going to reach with my hand. And those, in a certain way, by definition, can't be massively parallel, because you have two hands, so you could possibly make two decisions, but you basically can only do one thing, right? And to me, I think that my hunch is that there's a very big clue there about what consciousness is for. Something that lots of other neuroscientists have talked about, that it's really about guiding bodily action.
Okay, so Dr. Barrett, let's end our conversation on that note. But just before we go, would you like to tell people where are the best places on the internet for them to find your work?
Oh, well, I'm actually don't have a huge internet presence in terms of blogging or anything like that. That may change in the near future. But the things that I would point people to are the book, The Shape of Thought, which you mentioned, journal articles, and then I'll just very briefly mention that my current research project is called The Geography of Philosophy. It's a project that's funded by the Templeton Foundation. And we're doing cross-cultural research on the philosophical concepts of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. And we're interested in how those concepts are similar or differ around the world. It's a project that's led by me and two philosophers, Edward Mashery at Pitt and Steve Stitch at Rutgers. So we do have a website. If you search Geography of Philosophy, you'll find it. And that's where a lot of my research effort has been going lately, and we'll be coming out with papers over the next few years.
Okay, great. So I will be leaving links to your work in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out, and also a link to your book, of course, which was a great read for me at least. And again, thank you for taking the time, and it was really fun to talk to you.
It was a great pleasure for me as well. Thanks. And take care, and I'll talk to you soon.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been doing regular interviews with top academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, and even more so after or during this coronavirus crisis, I would really like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount you feel comfortable with. Otherwise, and if you prefer PayPal, I also have links to it for monthly subscriptions and also for one time or several times big donations, whatever you prefer. And if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Peroga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Belby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Yevon Bodrenko, Hall Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva. My producers, Isar Weber, Rosie, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codreanu, Luis Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Van Egdam and Curtis Dixon, and my executive producer, Michel Rugieski. Thank you for all.